Welcome to the Governance Podcast, hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance in Society here at King's College London. My name is Mark Pennington and I'm the Director of the Centre. One of the themes that we've been examining here at the CSGS is that of ecological security, and in particular the challenge of climate change governance. I'm delighted therefore to have with me today one of the world's leading experts on climate change and the challenges it presents to various governance systems. Professor Michael Hulme is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Cambridge, and he's the author of numerous works, notably Why We Disagree About Climate Change with Cambridge University Press in 2009, and most recently, the very simply entitled Climate Change, published by Routledge earlier this year. So Mike, it's great to have you with us here at the Centre. I wonder if we could start off with you just giving a bit of an indication of the motivation for the new book, Climate Change.
Well, the new book is part of a series that Routledge publish on key ideas in geography. It's been going about 12 or 15 years. It's a relatively occasional series, so it takes a few big themes in geography, geographical thought, like nature, place, cities, and the editor series approached me and said, look, we think climate change is a sufficiently weighty idea for this to be tackled in the Key Ideas in Geography series. And I seemed to fit the bill as someone who could look across the sweep of thinking behind climate change as it's emerged in recent years in particular. And so, I was keen to give this a go, really, because it just gave me a platform to think at a meta level about climate change as an idea, not necessarily as a problem to be solved, but to reflect on the different ways in which both historically, culturally, politically, ethically, scientifically, this idea of climate change has come to be actually now very much in the foreground, of course, of our contemporary world. So it was a great opportunity to bring a lot of my thinking together in one volume.
Well, when I read the book, as I did a couple of months ago now, actually, what struck me was the parallel between the way it's set out, where you contrast sort of scientific approaches to climate change with approaches that you describe as being beyond science, to some of the arguments from your previous book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. And a key theme of that book really was this idea taken from cultural theory that you can't really understand the disagreements about climate change and what to do about it without understanding the fact that people view it through different cultural lenses, and that a sort of robust approach to the problem requires that we have this sort of cultural pluralism reflected in the way that we discuss the topic. So could you speak a little bit more about that and how your previous work in this area has informed this new volume?
Yeah, so the original book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, was very much inspired by my experiences working within a research centre of academics from different disciplines, sciences, engineering, economics, social science, organised in order to do new innovative research around climate change and offer, I think of the rubric we had in the Tyndall Centre was to produce sustainable solutions for climate change. And in a sense, we all subscribed to that ambition. And yet the interesting thing that I observed over a number of years is that actually if we sat down privately or informally in the pub or in the bar or over a meal, we actually ended up having quite different views about what constitutes a solution to climate change. We sort of rhetorically would present externally, of course we're all working together, but we all came at this question of climate change with different presumptions, assumptions, ideologies, values, moralities, and so on. And I wanted to put these foreground these in the book. And cultural theory, inspired by Mary Douglas, particularly the idea that one might group individuals in societies into these four categories of hierarchs, individualists, egalitarians, and fatalists. This idea of cultural theory just became, at the very least, a useful heuristic for me to explore this. And it's not a case then, and this again is something that I've wrote about back then, and certainly has inspired my latest book, it's not just a case of getting everybody to subscribe to a particular reading of the science behind climate change, as though somehow just that educational, pedagogic achievement would somehow eradicate all these differences in how we think about ourselves and the world. No, of course not. We might take science seriously. All of us might, a hierarch and an individualist might very well take science seriously. But what that science about climate change is meaning to them in terms of political action in the world could be very, very different. Not because they somehow are nefarious agents or they are a priori skeptical of the science, although clearly some people are skeptical of science, but you can take the science, as it were, at face value and still do different things with it, in my view, quite rationally and reasonably, according to those prior commitments. And cultural theory helps, at least, as I say, heuristically to provide a structure to understand that. And I think that the reason why this, to me, is so important, and how I partly structure this new book around this whole line of thinking too, is that it actually creates more spaces for political agonism in a society, rather than, as it were, everybody being coerced into thinking about this problem in a singular, universal or absolutist way. And to me, that's almost the opposite of politics. Politics needs to have agonism if it actually is to be at all creative in our society.
So I take the point very much there that data or science never speak for themselves, that they can be interpreted in different ways, and that creative solutions to any kind of problem really need different interpretations or different lenses to come to bear upon it. But if you think of the COP26 summit that we've just had the last couple of weeks or so, there's very much a strong emphasis there on numbers, perhaps not recognizing that they can be interpreted in different ways. How do you read that? How do you read what has happened at the COP26 summit through the lens that you bring in this book and the previous book?
So I think the interesting thing is about how numbers work in political and public discourse. I mean, numbers are, of course, integral to science, and actually numbers are integral to understanding climate. I mean, I got into climate change actually because I was fascinated with numbers. I used to study, the weather, and I used to try to measure the weather by reading my thermometer, and I like playing around with numbers and statistics. So in a way, numbers are absolutely central to climate science in general. But numbers have a different discursive feel to them when they enter into public spaces, and they can very quickly become solidified and reified in a way that scientists wouldn't very often recognize, because we always recognize that numbers are provisional and got uncertainties scattered around them. But numbers have become, and I think in an unhelpful way, at the very center of our political thinking, and certainly actually also around some of our civic campaigning around climate change. It's all about numbers. It's about 1.5 to stay alive. It's about net zero by 2025. And if it's not by 2025 net zero, then it's all over. We're finished. And that reification of numbers, I find, is deeply unhelpful. It closes down spaces where actually different political arguments can be given equal weight and space to be at least heard. Of course, political arguments are always arguments about something, but they shouldn't be arguments about, is the number going to be achieved or is it not going to be achieved? It should be about forms of intervention that will bring about a particular set of goods or carry a particular set of risks. And some of the rhetoric around the COPs has become increasingly I think in the last, or certainly this one at Glasgow, was very much focused around getting the numbers, as it were, lined up in a row so that success could be claimed, as though it's somehow all about the numbers. So numbers can mask these underlying political disagreements. And so one saw the rather astonishing sight, in my view, at least at Glasgow, of the British chair of the conference, Sharma, castigating the Indian Prime Minister for offering something actually quite remarkable in the history of climate politics, that India would set itself a net zero target, but by only 2070. And saying, well, 2070 is way too late. You're not playing the game. You're breaking ranks from the community of nations. But it was all about the number being wrong, rather than actually recognizing the politics behind why Modi made that statement. And if you understand anything at all about India, you understand exactly why he offered a number way down the track, because there are very other important, significant, pressing issues that India faces beyond just simply eradicating coal within the next 5, 10, 20 years. So numbers mask genuine and important scientific conflict and contest that needs, I think, to be foregrounded and not hidden behind numbers.
So, I mean, do politicians like to use numbers because they do mask those underlying conflicts? Or do you think the fact that numbers have become so important in these debates reflects the dominance of a particular sort of cultural frame in the way that we think about the climate change problem? Or are those two things maybe related in some way?
I think they're related. Both of them, we can see them at work. I remember in the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit back in 2009, there was a big science congress in Copenhagen in Denmark. And the then Danish environment minister, who was going to be chairing the subsequent conference a few months later, he made this speech to the assembled ranks of hundreds of scientists from around the world, saying what he wanted from this congress before the politics at Copenhagen was a number. He wanted a number, not a range of numbers, not a number with uncertainties. Just give me a number that I can work with. Because politicians, they feel then that they have the non-negotiable authority of science behind them to go into a negotiation. They can say, well, I can't negotiate on this number because science has told me what the number is. If the number, rather than being 2 degrees, had been, well, somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 is fine, the politician would feel that they didn't have so much power in that negotiation than if they can play a precise number of 2. So I think there's something here for sure about how politicians use science more generally, but numbers in particular, in order to, as it were, offer a particular trump card in any particular political negotiation. But then we also see a wider narrative that I think, certainly we saw this in Glasgow and in the UK at the moment, and in some other countries, that civic protest movements have created a cultural environment, a discursive cultural environment around climate change that again plays to numbers. Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future with Greta Thunberg have used numbers very powerfully in their rhetoric to say that if you don't do this by a certain date, then our future has been sacrificed for your self-interest. And so numbers have again been used as a proxy, an authoritative proxy, actually for what are fundamentally actually quite powerful ethical arguments. I mean, Thunberg's argument, whatever you may think of it, has got a certain amount of credibility, which is about intergenerational ethics. Yeah. But the numbers get imported into that, and it then becomes a question about getting the numbers right. So numbers have this, again, even in these cultural social movements, they can mask legitimate political claims behind this appearance of scientific objectivity and non-negotiability. And again, they're always offered in this way that, well, we can't negotiate with a number, we can't negotiate with science, which I think can be very disingenuous.
I mean, that feeds in quite nicely to the next point I was going to ask you about, which was you've written quite critically in the past about what you see as being I guess, the errors of climate deadlineism, as you've described it. And obviously we saw arguably some of that at the recent conference. Could you run through what you think are the problems with that sort of deadlineist kind of approach to climate change, and where you think it may be leading us?
Well, so there are some obvious difficulties with the idea of these deadlines. I mean, the most obvious one, an intuitive one, is that we've had many of them and we've passed many of them, and the sky hasn't fallen, the world hasn't ended. Actually, there are still opportunities to make policy choices about the future. So in a sense, that's a very obvious problem with deadlines. They will come and they will go, and there is always life on the other side of the deadline. So actually, in the end, what is the deadline pointing to? It isn't pointing to anything physical in the real physical world. It actually becomes a rhetorical ploy. So that's one obvious problem. The other problem with deadlines is that they, again, do place too much faith in scientific knowledge. In a way, you can trace back the origins of these numbers to particular scientific claims. And yet all these scientific claims, particularly about Earth system science, climate science, and climate prediction, all of these claims are contingent, they're provisional, they're hedged with uncertainties or probabilities. But when they appear as a number, a deadline, all of that gets stripped away, and all you're left with is, well, this is what's going to happen at this particular date. So it doesn't do justice, actually, to the contingency and the provisionality of scientific knowledge. It seems to me that again can be disingenuous. And I think a third problem with deadlines, partly linked to the first point I make, that deadlines will always be exceeded, is what is the psychological effect of citizens, advocates, campaigners? We see this particularly amongst young people at the moment, who, as it were, mobilize around the number, around the deadline, with great passion and energy and hope and expectation that this deadlineism will deliver some decisive political act, which in the end, of course, is unrealistic. One cannot expect any particular conference, whether Glasgow or anywhere else, to sort of provide the once and for all definitive breakthrough that will ensure that the deadline is met. But when that deadline is not met, when the politics doesn't change and the deadline is reached or passed, it can psychologically, it can seriously damage either people's faith in the science that they thought underlay the deadline, and when the world doesn't fall in, well, what actually lay behind this deadline in the first place? Or when politics cannot do the impossible of meeting a deadline of eradicating coal, for example, in 10 years' time, it leads to a cynicism about politics. And it also creates this anxiety, particularly we see this amongst young people, that they genuinely believe that there is a cliff edge. They genuinely believe that something catastrophic just lies over the horizon and that they will fall into the chasm. So for all these reasons, that the psychology of deadlineism, I think, can be, if at the very least, debilitating, at the very worst, actually, quite destructive in terms of how people engage with political life in general and how they understand science as an enterprise.
I'm going to come onto this a little bit more later on in the conversation, I think, but you advocate what I would broadly describe as a sort of pragmatist or pluralist approach to climate change. What would you say to someone, maybe who was pushing back on your previous point, who might say that we know that these deadlines aren't literally deadlines in some literal sense, but they might themselves be useful pragmatic devices to motivate some kind of action or awareness of the problem, that if you didn't use the language of deadlines, people wouldn't be motivated in the same way? How would you respond to that kind of argument, that this is a kind of pragmatist attempt to deal with the issue?
I think they can carry that sort of pragmatic reality, if they're understood and used in that way and they're not interpreted in literal form. On the other hand, I still wonder, even then, whether using the idea of deadlines with numbers attached to them is in some sense trying to short circuit what actually should be a more open, deliberative political process. It's almost as though the number and the rhetoric is being used coercively in order to close down or to short circuit decision making. And actually, it's interesting that there are numerical targets in various other forms of public policy, whether it's NHS waiting lists, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals. But they're very rarely used in the sense that something waits on the other side of the failure to hit the deadline. I mean, yes, it's a failure of policy if the NHS targets are not met, but it's not as though somehow, if they're not met, the NHS falls into ruin. Or equally, poverty. Yes, there are targets and even dates on those targets in the SDGs, for example. But the rhetoric is not being used that somehow if you don't get poverty down 50% but only 30%, then it's all over, game up. It's this type of absolutism or binary thinking that you either succeed or you fail, and if you fail, then it's the end. It's that component, I think, of the numbers and the deadlines that I see as not helpful. But I recognise that numbers and targets can have a place in a much more pragmatic, open form of political advocacy.
So maybe we could explore that a little bit more. I mean, you talk, I think, quite persuasively towards the end of the new book about the idea of seeing climate change as a predicament. So it's something that is not going to go away ever. It's not something that can ever be solved as such. It's rather a sort of permanent challenge which constantly raises different sorts of questions that people may have to approach in different ways. And I read what you're saying there almost as it's a sort of opportunity to have a sort of creative dialogue across these multiple sort of cultural lenses, if you like. So could you say a little bit more about what it means to view climate change as a predicament, and how would you see, say, a COP26 which is informed by that kind of view unfolding differently to what we've just witnessed?
So that's a really interesting question. Partly I use the idea of the predicament as a counterpoint to the problem solution frame that has too easily dominated some of the discourse and argumentation about climate change, and which is itself informed by a very mechanistic understanding of the planet, much as an engineer would seek to repair an internal combustion engine. The planet is simply a machine that's broken down and needs repair. The idea of the predicament takes us away from that type of thinking, which I think is unhelpful. The predicament focuses on what is irresolvable in a particular situation. It's not to say that there are not better or worse ways of dealing with a predicament or living through a predicament, and of course there are, but it's recognizing that at the end, you're not going to eradicate the problem entirely. You're going to have to find ways of coping and surviving, probably for a sustained long period of time, and that certainly I think is the case with climate change. And also the idea of the predicament plays, of course, very nicely into, I think, some of the resources, the cultural resources that can be mobilized by the humanities disciplines, for example, where ambiguity, tension, analogues of how other people have dealt with predicaments in narrative form are often foregrounded in creative fiction, and so it just opens a space for thinking about those types of stories. And actually, there's a really nice exploration of that in a book coming out very soon called Story Listening by Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig, the power of, or the importance of listening to stories in a policy, in a political process, because stories are as much a piece of evidence about how societies and how people think of themselves in societies as scientific facts might be. Yeah. So predicaments open up all of these windows, if you will, that deal much more appropriately with ambiguous, ambivalent, troubling, wicked type problems. How would the COP in Glasgow have played out differently if that had been the dominant discourse rather than the deadline of net zero? That's a really interesting question to ask me. I would like to think that, again, it would create space. Thinking climate change as a predicament would give space for people from different national cultural perspectives to foreground what climate change actually meant for them. And we did see that to some degree, I think, actually, in some of the activities around Glasgow. So, for example, there was an opening poem that was brought, and a poem is actually a nice way of decentering scientific knowledge and foregrounding a much more emotional or personal reading of what a problem is. So I think predicaments would have created more of those types of opportunities, and it would also, I think, have avoided some of the performativity that we saw from political spokespeople or government leaders, as it were, almost seeking to outbid each other, or my number's bigger than your number, or my deadline for net zero is shorter than your deadline for net zero. Again, which is inspired, of course, by the idea of numbers being part of the solution, whereas predicaments would actually foreground the very difficult political choices and trade-offs that different world leaders face in their own jurisdictions. I mean, what Modi faces in India is a very different set of factors to weigh up, whatever you may think of Modi. I mean, whether you think he's a skillful politician or not, he generally does have a different set of constellations in front of him compared to Boris Johnson, compared to Joe Biden. And in a sense, seeing the multiple predicaments in that sense that world leaders have in their particular context, rather than thinking that we're all playing the same game, which is to bring the global planet to some safe landing, and whatever local little difficulties we have just are subdued in sight of this greater cosmopolitan good. Seeing climate change itself inherently as a predicament, I think would give greater recognition to these very, very different contexts in which leaders, politicians, policymakers, and a whole variety of other political actors find themselves in. How you trade one interest against another, how you trade one good against another good. Recognizing, for example, that there are real trade-offs, for example, between biodiversity goals and climate change goals. There may be some synergies, but equally there are some dyssynergies and trade-offs where you can't do everything at the same time to satisfy all these multiple goals. And that, in a way, is what a predicament is. You have got two competing goods. Yeah. Well, you can't achieve both of them. So let's be honest and face that and recognize that deliberately.
How would you respond? I guess a concern that some people would have about that is, if you emphasize that there are these multiple trade-offs, and in a certain sense, I think many people would recognize that India is not in the same place. The way it weights its considerations may be different to people in the UK or in Germany. In a certain sense, I think people would recognize that. But on the other hand, I think they might say, once you start to emphasize this kind of pluralism in the trade-offs, you then open the door to people who don't want to do anything about climate change at all. They just want to read it in a certain way, which says, well, it just isn't worth it for us to do anything about this. So you have this tension between, on the one hand, I know a concern that you have, which is that countries like India are almost being sort of disciplined by some universal standard. But on the other hand, if you don't have that standard, what is the motivation for people, not to just say, well, to us, it's not a problem.
Mm. Well, that depends whether you actually do think there is some overarching universal standard that either disciplines all nations or actually, as it filters down, should discipline each and every one of us. And I think, my reading actually of the world in which I see and inhabit and read is I'm not sure actually that there are such universal standards, or at least if there are, I'm not sure other than the deities who knows them. Science sometimes would seek to usurp that sort of divine authority and oversight as to what everybody should buy into. But actually, if you look around, and this is partly back to cultural theory, if we look around empirically at how people think and reason and act in the world, and the values and the standards that they foreground and treasure, people are different. Period. And cultural theory is one way of grouping people according to those 4 different instincts, but there are other ways. We can contrast the utilitarian as opposed to the deontological or the virtue ethicist. These are serious, what do you call them? Values, instincts, intuitions, commitments to the way in which we think about good and ethical decisions. Who's to say that everybody should become a utilitarian? And actually, in a sense, we probably, and again, cultural theory would argue this, we work better as a society, as some sort of social entity, by recognizing that the utilitarian and the deontological and the virtue ethicists actually each bring something to the table, and listening to those, respecting those, and arguing through. There's still got to be argumentation in the end about what you decide to do. There's got to be closure as well as an opening up. But it's moving away from this idea that there is a universal standard, just waiting to be discovered by science or pronounced by God. And again, we're back here to my reading of what constitutes a full and well-functioning politics in any social organization. I often use the example of the small family unit. You've got maybe 2 adults and 3 children. They've got to decide where they're going to go on holiday. Well, everyone's got their own views about where they want to go on holiday, and there are different ways you can deal with that conflict. That's a political conflict within a family. The dominant adult could decide where they're going to go on holiday, and they could invoke all sorts of reasons why everyone's going to go there. Or you could have a democratic vote, or before you have the vote, you could actually go through an open process of, well, why do you think? And you then begin to understand, why are people preferring Germany rather than Ireland? And actually through that deliberative process, there might be some convergence within the family unit, or there might not. And if there isn't, there's still got to be some closure. So then you've got to find, well, what are the rules of closure in this particular family? It still might be the dominant adult who has the casting vote, but actually then might be another deliberative. So that's a useful analogy, it seems to me, of recognizing both of the importance, well, first of all, the recognition that we are different, we think differently, and we have credible reasons why we think differently about things. We need to listen to each other in some sort of deliberative setting, but we also have to have rules of closure. Otherwise, we're just paralyzed. So I think this, to me, would be why I would not recognize the imposition of some universal standard, or even some claim that everybody has got to subscribe to, that stopping climate change is the ultimate political good. There are counter-arguments to that need to be heard and recognized.
Well, I think, don't these tensions also play out when we think about power relationships that are operating here as well. So, I mean, I think a very powerful argument that many people make is that if you don't encourage dramatic action on climate change, you're sort of reinforcing a power dynamic which is privileging countries that have over the years emitted significant amounts of CO2 and that could be in some sense threatening people in other parts of the world. But then the flip side of that is if you create a new set of power relations where people impose from the center a climate deadline or whatever it is, that may have detrimental impacts on people as well. So we've got power relations, whichever kind of set of decisions are made. How do we actually balance those kind of considerations? And that seems to me a central issue here.
Yes, it is. And one could argue that the machinery that has been set up, the transnational intergovernmental machinery that's been set up over 30 years, is an attempt to try to provide that sort of deliberating space. You have UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and then the annual meetings of the parties. So you could argue that that actually is the machinery here. On the other hand, and maybe the reason actually why we still are at the place we are here in 2021, given that we started this whole process back in 1992, is that actually we're embarking on something that we've got no idea whether it's achievable or not. I mean, this is a if you just take the headline goals of the UNFCCC back in 1992, this is a project that humanity has never before embarked upon, of orchestrating political action from top to bottom around the world in order to make some seemingly quite fundamental changes to economic, social, and political development in such a way as to steer the world to some, in this case, numerical outcome. I mean, that's a project that has never previously certainly been secured, even if attempted, I would argue. So in a sense, this whole machinery that's been created is experimental, and it's proving to be a very difficult experiment to bring to a closure. And it may very well never reach closure, or at least not closure in the sense that some of the campaigners or the rhetorics of a safe landing would like to see. And there are different reactions to that prospect. One is to despair and give up. Another is to short circuit that process, again, either by the intervention from, the scientific rationalist who, as it were, will just cut through all of that difficult politics and interest conflict, or a power grab. I mean, in a literal sense, actually, one could, and actually, I do sometimes wonder where the rhetoric of deadlines might end up, even in traditionally liberal democracies, that actually, if powerful campaigners and activists and social movements feel that there is no future in deliberative democracy, then we may see something darker emerge even here. So that is another scenario. The other scenario to this is to say, well, we just keep on going. The experiment will just keep on going, and it may go round in circles for a bit. On the other hand, there may be from time to time, certain movements, like a ratchet, that take us one step forward. But actually, in the end, the experiment is an open-ended experiment, which we've got no idea where it ends. But we are committed to the experiment because we're committed to that type of open, democratic, deliberative process. So there are different scenarios you could paint about this whole process. But I do fear the use of what we could call scientific absolutism or scientific rationalism that says well, we have to deliver this at all costs, and all costs means an authoritarian regime. And here, I mean, I know we're not talking about the pandemic and the governance of pandemics, but actually one can begin to see some crossovers here between the ways in which governments have thought about pandemics and the ways in which powers have been centralized in the name of an epidemiological model or a particular advisory group or a particular stated absolute goal that we must get incidence rates below a certain threshold, whatever. And so I think we can see some of the same potential dynamics as undercurrents or undertones within the climate discourse.
I mean, it's interesting you said that. I know there have been some people who've made reference to the potential need for climate lockdowns in the way that there have been in terms of the response to the pandemic. But what I was going to ask you was, I mean, one argument that people would put forward to the reason that, we've never embarked on anything like this before is that the world hasn't perceived there to be a problem like climate change before. Now, in your view, you go with the idea that climate change is a wicked problem, is this multidimensional type problem. Are there examples of other sort of wicked problems that you think have been addressed in this predicament or open-ended type way of viewing something that we might be able to learn from in the context of climate change? What other wicked problems or problems that have got the characteristics of wickedness are out there that we've seen some of the sort of things that you would like to emphasize?
Yeah. Perhaps easier to point the other direction. I mean, one or two problems that would perceive to be tame, as it were, and actually this is...
And that are wicked.
That are wicked, or actually are relatively tame. I mean, actually, the ozone issue is often held out as partly inspiring the objectives and the emergence of a global climate regime, but actually an inappropriate inspiration, because the ozone issue was actually quite a tame issue. It was one family of chemicals produced by a very small number of industrial companies that had a very deleterious effect on the ozone layer. And in a sense, the interests involved here, the degrees of freedom were orders of magnitude fewer than they are with climate change. And so we set up a machinery that was reasonably effective at dealing with the tame problem of ozone depletion. And we thought, right, this is the way in which we can solve climate change. Absolutely not, because you cannot just import one architecture into a wicked problem. Are there other wicked issues? I mean, there are wicked issues in the world. Poverty would be one, I think. And, however you want to look at poverty, poverty has, since the earliest, well, I don't know how far back you'd like to go in recorded history, but certainly some of the earliest religious texts, certainly in my tradition of, Christianity, will talk about poverty, and actually, will say the poor will always be with you. So this is a wicked problem that has not gone away in 2,000 years or longer. The more concentrated efforts to eradicate poverty after the Second World War have had some benefits, but also some disbenefits. But poverty is certainly a scourge that continues, whether it's absolute poverty or relative poverty. So we could see poverty as a wicked issue. But that's not, again, to give up on finding ways in which we can make incremental progress towards what we see as a desirable condition, i.e. the ending of poverty, knowing that we will never get there. But there are still incremental interventions that we can make, but not on the scale of some big orchestrated, top-down set of rules or procedures that it's just unrealistic to think that, well, we could take population. I maybe as another wicked issue. Certainly, natures and cultures have got very different attitudes towards population management. We can go back and think about sterilization, forced sterilization in India, or impose regulation of one-child families in China. or we can think of a more open set of policies that, for example, indirectly deal with this through female emancipation and education. Are we ever going to be able to control global population in the sense of we're trying to control global temperature? I don't think so. So I'm not sure there are any. I mean, there are examples of wicked issues, but no examples of wicked issues that have been turned into tame issues. Although that's an interesting thought. Could you turn a wicked issue into a tame issue? I'm not sure.
So, what is next for you, Mike? So you've had this new book out on climate change, which is bringing a lot of these ideas together. Where do you intend to take this next in the sort of next stage of your writing? Have you got sort of plans for new projects that take these ideas forward, or how's it going to evolve?
Yes, well, I've got a couple of projects. One fairly advanced now, which is recognizing the significance of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as a way of orchestrating scientific knowledge and crafting it in ways that are engaged with by political actors. The IPCC has become a crucially important institution, powerful institution, both for its orchestration of science, but also the way in which it shaped the politics of climate change. So we're actually, with a colleague, working on an edited collection of short essays from critical social scientists and STS scholars, bringing together everything that we have understood about how the IPCC operates. So we call it a critical assessment of the IPCC, because we think that's important, because people don't fully understand really how the IPCC operates and what sort of knowledge it produces. So that's a project beginning to reach conclusion. And I think the other line, I mean, this may or may not materialize, but I want to write a further book that makes a rather shorter, more punchy contribution. I think the book Climate Change: Key Ideas in Geography provides a synoptic map, certainly from my perspective, but a synoptic map of how the idea of climate change has emerged and its historical and cultural and epistemic attachments to it. But I want to write a book that I'm provisionally calling Climatism, which is trying to draw attention in a much more succinct way to the lines of thought that have allowed us to put controlling climate as the overarching number one political objective of planetary life. And I'm skeptical of that move. And I use the idea of climatism deliberately to attach it with ideological thought and influence, because I do think there are some darker sides to what I call climatism. So that's there in the medium term, I think, for next year.
So is the idea there how you can get sort of different ideologies to, I mean, I guess following on from the cultural theory, to sort of get a mix of ideologies instead of there being a single view. Is that the idea that's behind that theme, or the insistence that climate ought to be viewed in one way rather than perhaps in multiple ways? Is that?
I think it's more to dislodge the assumption, either explicit or implicit, that the
issue should be central.
The climate and controlling climate sits at the heart of contemporary politics. I wrote a piece a decade ago now called about climate reductionism, which it was about reducing the future to climate, as though the only thing that's going to be shaping how the world is in 50 years' time is going to be climate. And that was very widely read, the idea of climate reductionism. In a sense, climatism is drawing attention to the present, and it's actually saying that we're collapsing politics in the present to this one single issue of climate. And that carries some dangers with it. I understand the reasons why that's happened, but by doing that, we may be doing so at a cost, not about 50 years' time, but actually a cost today to the nature of the political project. And as I think mentioned previously, the very idea that actually democracy, liberal democracy, is a form of social organization that we should continue to invest in. And there are some threats not just on the horizon. I mean, one or two of these threats are a little bit coming closer to home, I think we've seen in recent years. The rise of populism, both of the left and of the right varieties. And I feel that climatism, as it were, needs to be called out as a particular ideology that has a darker side, a potentially darker side to it.
I mean, I guess just to finish off on that, I mean, do you see the danger there in being in terms of populist movements sort of reacting to what is coming from this climatist agenda, in the sense that groups that feel that it's not being delivered in the way they see it can use that as a justification for attacking existing structures, and likewise groups that interpret it in a different way could be attacking those institutions as well. So you kind of have a civil war almost. That's rather dramatic language perhaps, but focused on these sort of completely opposing reactions to this issue, when, you know, from everything I've read of your work, it suggests we need a mixture of nuanced kind of responses to this problem.
Yeah, I think it can come from both angles. You know, and the danger is the erosion of what I would see as some of the central institutions of liberal democracies. And actually, there's an even more insidious prospect I could argue for, which is, and we've seen this a little bit in some of the climate youth movements, the growing cynicism that they would appear to have about certain political processes and institutions and venues actually can be used as a Trojan horse by those on the political right in order to say, well, we told you so. You know, your elites have let you down. And actually, we know, again, through political history, that strange as it is, sometimes it's easier to move from the extreme political left to the extreme political right without going through the middle. There are back doors, actually, that somehow quite quickly one can move from one extreme to another. And if we perpetuate this notion that somehow democracy has failed us on climate change, we're opening the door to actors who may have more sinister and nefarious intent.
People who didn't believe in democracy in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, well, on that rather provocative note, thank you very much, Mike, for joining us today on the Governance Podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.